Imagine this. You're walking through a medieval town square. The smell of bread mixes with the stench of sewage. Crowds gather, not for a festival, but to laugh at a man locked in a wooden contraption, his head and arms sticking out like a caged animal. Someone throws a rotten tomato, another spits, and the punishment has only just begun. The Middle Ages were brutal, but beyond the battles and castles, there was another side of life: punishment. Strange, humiliating, and often painful methods designed not only to correct, but to entertain. Today, we were diving into the weirdest punishments of the Middle Ages, from iron masks and dunking stools to the bizarre use of animals in courtrooms. These punishments may sound unbelievable, but they were very real, and some of them might leave you wondering, were people in the Middle Ages cruel or just creative? Stay with me, because the strangest one comes at the end, and you won't see it coming. Let's start with a classic image, the stocks and the pillory. If you think about medieval punishment, this is probably the first picture in your head. A person, locked in a wooden frame in the middle of town, unable to move while everyone mocked them. The stocks held your feet. The pillory held your head and hands. Sometimes offenders spent hours, sometimes days, trapped in these awkward devices. But the real punishment wasn't the restraint. It was the humiliation. Crowds gathered to throw rotten food, dead animals, or worse. In some towns, people even brought chamber pots and emptied them onto the prisoner. What crimes earned you this punishment? Not murder or treason, but things like cheating at cards, selling bad bread, or gossiping too much. Imagine being publicly shamed for something that today might earn you just a warning, or maybe a bad review online. And here's the strange twist. Many towns required citizens to participate in mocking the prisoner. Ignoring someone in the stocks could get you fined. In other words, humiliation wasn't just tolerated. It was community entertainment. Now let's talk about water. Not for drinking, but for dunking. The dunking stool was a wooden chair attached to a long beam designed to dunk troublesome people into rivers or ponds. And who ended up in these chairs? Often women accused of being scolds, a term for someone who nagged, gossiped, or argued too much. In some towns, it was called the cucking stool. The punishment was simple and humiliating. A crowd gathered, the accused was strapped in, and then dunked repeatedly into the cold, filthy water. Sometimes just a few times, sometimes until they nearly drowned. It wasn't always fatal, but it was terrifying. And again, the goal wasn't just discipline, it was spectacle. People came to laugh, cheer, and watch the scold get a soaking. But here's a curious twist. Over time, this punishment became associated with witch trials. If the accused floated, people thought it meant they were rejecting holy water, and therefore a witch. If they sank, they were innocent, though of course drowning made that innocence meaningless. It was a lose-lose situation, and yet for medieval townsfolk, it was entertainment with a moral lesson. Now for something truly bizarre: putting animals on trial. Yes, in the Middle Ages, animals could be, and often were, treated like criminals. Pigs, goats, dogs, even insects. If an animal caused harm, it might be dragged before a judge. One of the most famous cases happened in France in the 15th century, when a pig killed a child. The pig was actually tried in court, found guilty, and executed. Sometimes animals were even dressed in human clothes before punishment, making the trial even more absurd. And it wasn't just livestock. Records show that swarms of locusts or weevils were excommunicated by the church for destroying crops. The church would literally issue orders telling the pests to leave town. On one level, this seems ridiculous. But in a society where religion and justice were deeply intertwined, it made sense. If humans could be punished for sin, why not animals? It is one of the strangest windows into the medieval mindset, a belief that justice applied to every living creature, whether they understood it or not. If humiliation was the theme of medieval punishment, nothing made it more obvious than the mask of shame. These were iron masks, often shaped like grotesque animals or demons. Imagine being forced to walk through town wearing a metal dog's head, complete with ears and snout, while people laughed at you. Each mask was designed to fit the crime. A gossip might wear a mask with a long tongue. A liar might wear one with a snout. And some even had spikes inside, pressing against the tongue to stop the wearer from speaking. The punishment wasn't just heavy and uncomfortable, it was psychological torture. You couldn't hide, you couldn't talk, and everyone knew exactly why you were being humiliated. In some cases, offenders were paraded around town, turned into living spectacles. Imagine walking through the streets, iron scraping your skin, children laughing, and knowing every neighbor would remember the mask you wore. For medieval people, shame was often worse than pain, and the mask of shame delivered both. Not all punishments were strange. Some were just brutally simple. The whipping post was exactly what it sounds like. Offenders tied up in public, whipped across the back until they bled. This punishment was used for theft, debt, and moral crimes. The idea was to leave visible scars, a reminder of both sin and justice. And like the stocks, whipping was a public event. People gathered to watch. Some cheered, others jeered. For the condemned, the pain was real, but the humiliation was often worse. Now here's one you might not expect: punishment by noise. In many medieval towns, if someone broke social rules, say a man married a much younger woman, or a widow remarried too quickly, the community would stage a charivari. This was basically a noisy, mocking parade. Villagers gathered outside the person's home, banging pots, blowing horns, and shouting insults late into the night. Sometimes the offender was dragged into the street and paraded on a donkey, facing backward as a symbol of shame. No prison cells, no whips, just relentless public humiliation. It shows us something important. In the Middle Ages, punishment wasn't just about law. It was about enforcing social norms, keeping everyone in line through ridicule. Have you ever had a night of drinking you'd rather forget? In the Middle Ages, you wouldn't be allowed to. One punishment for drunkards was the Drunkard's cloak, a giant barrel with holes cut for the arms and head. The offender was forced to wear it through town, stumbling under its weight while everyone laughed. Imagine trying to walk while trapped in a giant wooden keg, the crowd jeering, pointing, and throwing things. The message was clear: drink too much, and you'll be turned into a walking joke. Sometimes punishment wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about divine judgment. In the Middle Ages, people believed God would reveal the truth through trials by ordeal. There were many forms: walking barefoot across hot irons, holding a red-hot piece of metal, being thrown into water. The belief was that God would protect the innocent. If you burned, drowned, or blistered, it meant you were guilty. If you survived unscathed, God had saved you. These ordeals weren't just punishments, they were terrifying gambles, where your life depended on divine intervention. It's hard to imagine now, but for medieval people it felt fair. If God ruled the world, who better to decide guilt or innocence? Of course, some punishments ended in death, but even here, the Middle Ages had strange variations. In Germany, bakers who cheated customers were allegedly baked alive in their own ovens. Millers who shortchanged grain could be drowned in their own mills. In other regions, traitors were sewn into sacks with animals, cats, snakes, even monkeys, and thrown into rivers. Were these punishments common? Not really, but the fact that they existed at all shows just how creative and cruel medieval justice could be. So what do we make of all this? The Middle Ages were harsh, but punishments weren't just about pain. They were about shame, spectacle, and control. From stocks to dunking stools, from iron masks to noisy parades, the real goal was making an example, reminding the community, this is what happens when you break the rules. To us, these punishments seem bizarre, even barbaric. But for medieval people, they made sense. Justice was public, humiliation was powerful, and a little cruelty kept society in order. Still, it makes you wonder, in 1,000 years, will people look back at our justice system with the same disbelief? Thanks for joining me on this journey into the weird punishments of the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more strange stories from the past. And remember, sometimes history is weirder than fiction.